Okay, well, good evening, everybody. Nice to see some old friends in the audience, and it's a shame we're not all together, so we can have a jolly good chat and a beer afterwards. But that's life at the moment. Well, I've done a number of talks on Warwickshire bells over the years, and they're sort of serious ones about who cast our bells and how important they are, and so on. And when Annie asked me to do this, I thought, no, it's time to do something a bit different, something perhaps a bit more personal. So there's a bit of autobiographical stuff in here, but it's really only the coat hanger that the rest is hanging on. What I really want to do is to tell you a little bit about what bell hunting activities involve, and to just share with you some of the places I've been to and some memories of people I've been with and things like that. So it's not too formal a lecture, I hope, but more of a bit of a mystery tour around Warwickshire. So, some of you who've seen the Guild newsletter may have seen this article that I did about visiting my last bell in Warwickshire last year. In the middle of lockdown, I got a call from the Roman Catholic priest at Basley Clinton saying, "We've got scaffolding up. Would you like to come and look at our bell?" Well, I was very keen to do so. Hello?
What did he say?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. I was very keen to go to Basley Clinton because it's a bell that you really can't see adequately from the ground through telescope. And I'd actually missed two previous occasions when there'd been scaffolding up. But the point about it is that I think I can really say it was the last bell in Warwickshire that I particularly wanted to see because I hadn't got proper details. And so that completed what has been in effect a project of 52, 53 years since I first started. Of course, there are going to be other bells that turn up. I can't possibly have seen every single one. And there'll be plenty that I want to go and see again or where things have changed. But I did feel last year that I'd actually done Warwickshire. Okay, for the first time maybe, but I'd seen everything. Now, what I wanted to do is to ask you a question. When were you first aware of bells? When did bells start meaning something to you? Well, a little bit of background on me. I was born at the maternity hospital in Stratford-on-Avon, the birthplace, as we used to call it. And my childhood home was in Sheffield. Now, you probably haven't heard of Sheffield. There's a reason for that. It's only a very scattered settlement, and it's sort of midway between Aston Cantlow, Wootton and Studley and Coton. My parents moved there about 6 months before I was born and took over a pretty derelict cottage. You can see Mum there in the garden clearing the scrub. And that building in the middle is the outside dunny, which we lived with until I was about 12. So it was a fairly primitive sort of place, but really in a very nice part of the world, nice unspoilt countryside. There's the cottage at the bottom, as it was a bit later on. And that was my parents' home until they left in 1981. Now, I went to start off with to the village school at Aston Cantlow, which is still there. It closed as a school actually way back in the 60s, but it still looks more or less as if the school had only closed a few weeks ago. The toilets are still there in the yard and all sorts of stuff like that. Anyway, while I was at primary school, I do remember the bells being taken away for rehanging. Aston Cantlow were rehung and the treble recast in 1957. And I distinctly remember watching out of the window while doing painting to see the bells being wheeled on a trolley up and down the churchyard path. But also, when we were at home at Sheffield, we didn't have running hot water, and a bath on a Sunday afternoon was a ritual before we went to church. There was a Burco boiler in the corner that parents filled with cold water. When it came to the boil, all four of us had to go through the bath in quick succession. Kids first, parents last. And after my sister and I had got a bath, we were sent out into the garden, but under strict orders not to get dirty again before going down to church. And while we were out there, we would always hear the bells ringing and always listen out for them. So I think that's probably when I first became aware of bells. Later on, I was sent away to boarding school. My parents didn't really have much money at all, but mother came from a family where several generations had been away to boarding school, and I think they thought that's what ought to happen to me. So at the age of 8, I was sent away to boarding school, first at St Michael's, Tenbury, and then to King's School, Worcester, from the age of 13. They were both quite Spartan environments and very, very sporty, which was never me. Anyway, when I got to Worcester, I found that the regime was really quite tough for someone who'd come from being a senior boy in the other school to junior in the next one. And also, the exercise was a daily thing, you know, out for quite a long run every day, unless you've got something else to do. And I wasn't too keen on that. And after scratching around, I tried chess club. If you went to an activity, you got off the run. I tried chess club and really hated it. I tried a few other things, didn't like it much. And one day, one of the kids in the same class said to me, why don't you try change ringing? So I didn't even know where I was going, but I found myself in the tower at All Saints, Worcester. I really did not know I was going anywhere near bells. I didn't know I was even going to a church. I just followed this other kid to where he was going. But I think almost the moment I walked into the tower, I was just struck. I wanted to become a ringer. I loved seeing history all around. And we had a school change ringing society that actually had links with Warwick School at the time. I think just before I started to ring, there had been a joint summer holiday with some Warwickshire kids and some of ours. But we had an active band. We went out tinkering up bells. We rang a few school quarter peals and peals. And so it was really quite a good thing to join in with. And I loved it from the start. I just wanted to get into ringing and had this vain hope I might one day become a half-decent ringer. Well, the other important question is who taught you? And I always want to acknowledge Paul for having got me into ringing when I joined. Paul Cattermole was a teacher at the school. He actually taught maths, and he didn't do a very good job of that on me. But he did teach me to ring, and that was in the early 1960s. And Paul called my first peal. He'd been very active in Worcestershire with the Fellows brothers, John Eisel, seen there in that photograph, and was particularly keen on going to the unusual places and towers. And so that was the sort of environment that I joined. I was particularly chuffed when Paul invited us to go to Norfolk in 2002 when I was Master of the College Youths, because he particularly wanted to ring a peal with me in my year as Master. And we rang a nice peal and spent a nice day with them. But Paul very definitely taught me about bells as well as about ringing. He himself went on to be really quite an important bell historian. He wrote those 2 books, plus some others on Norfolk and other books not on bells. Although as a maths teacher, is absolutely fascinated by history, and I owe almost everything that I've done subsequently to that early start in ringing and in bells that Paul gave me. The sort of things we used to do, we'd go out and ring at some of the local 3-bell towers. Not all of them you might think very suitable for ringing. Just look at the one in the middle with that old headstock with little metal spur stay, and nice beaten up place where we got experience of ringing it on interesting bells. And White Ladies Aston, that tower shook about without any wind blowing on it, something rotten. So those 2 towers were a couple where we went and did maintenance, clear-ups, splicing ropes and things, and used to ring quite frequently. So we got used from an early stage to ringing on strange bells. School generally, though, was really quite restrictive. We were stuck in the boarding house every night, almost with no exception. So there was no going out and ringing of a weeknight at local practices. It was really just the Sunday ringing and the Thursday afternoon school practice. Several of the other kids in this photograph did get involved in bells one way or another. There were 2 of us in the photo who did ring peals. Several of the others did learn to ring and also rang handbells. So for me, ringing really took off when I came home in the school holidays to Sheffield. This slide should look better than it does, but unfortunately they've come out square rather than oval as I'd set them up. But the place that we lived was surrounded by towers, all within cycling distance and also within earshot. Ulster was 5 miles away, Henley was 5 miles away, but we could actually on occasion hear those bells in our garden in the middle of the countryside. Aston Cantlow was our parish church, Wootton, the place for the nearest bus stop, about 3 miles away. Coton were then unringable. Morton Bagot had a little chime of 2 that we could hear in the garden. And Studley over the hill in the Arrow Valley, you could hear those bells very clearly.
Arrow Valley.
On a practice night. So I got involved particularly at Wootton because there was a lively young band there. And Aston Cantlow had an old band that rang call changes off a stand. The conductor shouting the whole change, 2, 1, 3, 5, 4, 6, he'd shout, and then About a minute later, 2, 3, 1, 4, 5, 6. Got some quite good ringing though, and they used to ring up and down very well. Ulster, of course, has a lovely 8, and later in my school days, I went over there quite a lot on Thursdays and helped get the band into change ringing. When we lived in Warwickshire a bit later, incidentally, we went over there to a practice one week and found that they were ringing bob triples, and 3 different people would call themselves home for a very long touch. So you'd start off with the 6th observation, call 3 bobs, then somebody else, and then finally the 7th. It's all quite interesting. And Studley was a fun tower. There was a good band there, Jack Perkins in charge, absolutely ace at trebling up and down. Richard Sprague, still with us now, and a lively band where I learnt a lot and used to go there sometimes on Sundays. So that was really where I got into ringing. Other local bands, well, there's the Wootton Ringers in 1966. Peter Bennett and I have been in correspondence about this photograph recently because Alan Collings, who taught that band with Peter and others, has very recently died, sadly. But he was quite an influential figure when I got going too. Stratford, of course, had a good band. Youngsters, 2 of the girls in that picture, one of them is listening, were at school in the same class as my sister. But there's also the old boys at the front, old Reg Chapman, Jack Print, Fred Lyne, George Ingram, and Jim Steed, Clarence R. Steed, actually, but he called himself Jim, as I think you would. And in the middle at the back, good old John Findon, and we did have some fun with John. Oh, Doug's there as well, of course. So these were some of the towers that I used to go to and how ringing was back then. So Belfry exploring started for me in the school holidays too. And I think the first Warwickshire tower visits I did were at the local churches at Great Orne and Kinnerton. Both of them 1-bell towers. The Great Orne bell is in the middle there. Neither of those were very easy to get at, and I'll say a bit more about what it's like to get into some of these towers later. But I became good friends with the rector's son, Christopher Wayne, and we cycled around the area together, looking at bells and sharing an interest in cricket. Christopher was absolutely passionate about cricket. So in the middle of the summer, the test match was always on. Now, if you wanted to find out about bells in those days, before the internet, you had to look at old books, something that's very unfashionable today. The Dove at the time was the 3rd edition, the green one, which of course gives where all the bells are. And the series of county books on the bells of each of the English counties, Tilly and Walters's Church Bells of Warwickshire. It later became a book that you'd have to have some difficulty buying for a couple of £100. But back then, I was able to borrow a copy off the mobile library and hang on to it for about 2 months. Anyway, it gives details of all the bells in the county with inscriptions, sizes, and so on, and quite a lot of history. So that was getting hold of that rare book was the way that I started to find out about bells in the county. And also before the days of photocopiers. Well, perhaps one of the advantages of the strict boarding school regime was there was lots of time in the evening when we were under lock and key, sworn to silence, and copying out bell books longhand in full was actually rather more interesting than doing homework. So I ended up with copies of Church Bells of Worcestershire, Church Bells of Warwickshire, all done when there was nothing else really to do at school. But obtaining more information, everything that's now easily available from Dove was not that easy back then. I started writing to tailors, for example, and getting letters back with them with the details of bells that have eventually found their way onto the National Bell Register and onto Dove. But in those days, that information wasn't available at all. So the idea of revising the book on Warwickshire bells was the idea that was born to me as a 15-year-old. And that's when I started going around. Because Alveston, for example, had 3 more bells than in Tilly and Walters's day. There was additional information to find. So the idea was to go around checking on changes, additions and recastings, changing the attributions to founders if things that Tilly and Walters had said looked wrong, generally improving the accuracy and getting additional information, frames, fittings and so on, and also broadening the scope of the thing by adding historical background, documentary evidence and so on. I got going by going around taking notes in all the towers and writing it up. These happen to be Worcestershire examples because they're the only handwritten ones I've still got left. And they were written up in the style of Fred Sharp. Fred Sharp produced his book on church bells of Herefordshire just at this period when I was getting into it. And I thought Fred's books were the absolute bee's knees. So I tried to imitate his style and started corresponding with him as a 16-year-old in 1968. He died in the early 70s, but between those two dates, I got quite a lot of letters from him. And my first article in Ringing World, 1970. The 4 bell towers of Worcestershire. Very much, mucking about in these tiny unknown belfries that Paul had encouraged me to get into. Actually written jointly, but in fact I wrote it, and Paul, but wouldn't send it off to Ringing World without Paul checking it and having his name on it too. A little bit of overview of how the rest of the project panned out. So I started looking at Warwickshire bells in 1968, and in those early years did a lot of exploration by bike from Sheffield. Once I'd passed the driving test in February 1970, borrowed parents' car and got about. 1773, I was at Leicester University and very often had to hitchhike to and from to save money, and would quite often stop off. Wolvie, for example. I got a lift from maybe from Stratford to Warwick, walked across Warwick, got a lift to Coventry, walked across most of Coventry, got a lift up, and I'd stop off, get dropped off at Wolvie and hope to pick up another lift to get me on to Leicester. The university library and the study of history generally got me more into research, historical research, and things started to develop. But that was also a time when I fell foul of the guild authorities a bit, because they didn't like me going around at all these towers without supervision, and certainly didn't like me ringing at some of them, which for a time I was extremely keen on doing. So I became a bit persona non grata in the guild, but it never really put me off. From then on, I've always maintained this interest in Warwickshire bells, even though I spent a lot of my time living elsewhere. I was at home briefly at the end of 1973, and we taught a new band at Wootton at that stage. But really, it was December 1973 when I went back to work in Leicester that I effectively left the county. I had a job in Leicester and in the record office, which determined my future career, and then went off to London to study for my archives qualifications. But when I was down there, I did a lot of Warwickshire research in the Whitechapel Bell Foundry archives, for example. Coming back home, I lived in Malvern for a short while, working in Worcester, and then had 2 years in Hereford. But I kept coming over to Warwickshire, doing gap-filling tower visits, and I did actually start writing the book at that point. In 78, I moved to Bedford, and I finished the book in terms of the visits and writing up the towers in the early 1980s, but could not interest a publisher at all. But I still carried on throughout that. I got a lot of excellent photographs. The black and white photographs in this talk were taken by Christopher Dalton and taken for me. But by the end of all this process, I decided that the Sharp style book was wrong anyway. I wanted something that it had scope for putting in much more of the historical information, not just the description of the bells as they are. But during this time, I did produce the book on Coventry Cathedral bells in 1986. Work took me in other directions, and I kept on top of changes in Warwickshire. But when I was living in London, I did get my old 1980s book word processed ready for updating, and spent 15 months living back in Warwickshire to work on the project. Unfortunately, I brought with me work commitments that didn't quite let me spend as much time on it as I wanted, and I got a job that brought me over here to Stourbridge in 2004, and so the work stopped again. During my Pevsner years, when I was revising the book that Annie was waving at the beginning, I did revisit every single historic building in the county, and did a lot of bell visits, but it just wasn't possible to keep the book up to date as well. So this bell hunting, it's just a clipboard and desk job then. Go out and take some notes on a clipboard, get back and type them up. Well, I think, no, it's not. It's not really, because it's not a job of any sort. The fun of doing this is because of the places you go to and the interesting stuff that you see. Manchester, for example, really is a jewel of a belfry, and these are some of Christopher's photographs. There's a 1741 bell frame, 51 bell frame, very nicely built, perfectly good for purpose today, and quite an interesting one to see. 5 individually very interesting bells, every single one of them. 2 of them here are the medieval ones. So it's actually the joy of getting out and seeing these things and appreciating them that makes it all worthwhile. It's enjoyment first, but recording too while you're there. And it's also not just a job in terms of the fun is going with like-minded friends and enjoying these things together, sharing the experience. Keith Chambers and I did quite a lot together in the early 70s when I was in the area. Good friends in Whitnash certainly helped me with a number of visits around that time too. So, but it was a job of slowly plotting these visits on a map, because as I rediscovered when I did the Pevsner volume, covering the whole of a county like Warwickshire is a big job. There's a lot of places to go to. What does it involve? Well, for a start, old clothes. Overalls are absolutely essential if you're doing belfry inspections, because they can be pretty filthy places. Stout shoes, face masks, that's before COVID. A torch, of course, because a lot of belfries don't have electric lighting. Nowadays, a digital camera is fine, but in the old days, when you're reliant on taking one roll of film, you just couldn't afford to take too many photos. So much more can be done today. Notepad, paper, tape measure, calipers, all those sort of things. Nowadays, a digital recording kit for analysing bell frequencies. Back then, it was just tuning forks. For actually recording things, the rubbing technique that I've always used is pencil. The older people used heel ball. Wax that's used for brass rubbings really just flakes off the paper. But pencil rubbings using shaped pencils like I've got in the top can produce a very fine result, especially on nice flat lettering. The one on the right is a bell with astrological symbols at Clent in Worcestershire, a really strange discovery, and one that, rubbing was definitely needed. Taking plaster casts is another way of capturing details, like the ones shown there. Used to paint them. I haven't actually done any plaster casts for years, but it's a very good technique. In terms of note-taking, Ranald Clouston, another bell historian, has forms that he filled in meticulously. Christopher Dalton, sort of stream of consciousness notes, really, fascinating and useful, but not structured in terms of, this bell first, then another one, and then the frame, and so on, which is the way Ranald did it. And Fred Sharp always wrote up very neat copy. The real thing is that the information that's collected has fed into the national inventory of bell knowledge, and that's really what results in it. And having these notes that you can go back to. Mike Chester emailed me earlier about something, and I was able to answer his query from visit notes from 1989 very, very quickly. So it's having the information there, able to check it, and ready to hand. Right, we're moving on now to some of the visits and some of the stuff. Belfry exploration can be tricky. Access isn't always at all easy. When we're dealing with rings of bells, we're usually talking about places you've got a straight spiral staircase or a ladder. People are up and down there reasonably frequently. It's quite easy, and you've probably got electric lighting too. One of the most difficult places I've ever been to was Little Malvern Priory in Worcestershire, where up to the top when you get there, there's a fabulous 15th century 5-bell frame with just the single bell in it. A really remarkable survivor. And actually until the 1960s, there wasn't no access at all. You had to put a ladder up outside to get up there. But that straight ladder is really frightening. It's about 30 feet up, and at the top you have to open a trap door and get up through it. And then when you get up there, there's another 20 feet up to the bell frame, which has no floor. That's the sort of really scary sort of access that you can encounter. Turrets, of course, are particularly difficult. How do you get up to a bell turret? Well, in the 1940s, Arthur Wright, who wrote a book on Monmouthshire church bells, was a school teacher, and he just sent his boys up a ladder, not like on the left. Look at that lad perching in the turret on the top of the roof with a ladder. Health and safety, never mind. You quite often have to bring in ladders specially, and I've had long periods with having roof racks on a car to be able to cart ladders about. Christopher Dalton, who's there halfway up a ladder in that colour photo on the bottom, was absolute master about getting access to difficult belfries. Wolverton was a particularly difficult one that I got up on the eve of my 50th birthday, one of the last really difficult ones to get up. Nowadays, it's possible to use a cherry picker. I'm Bells Advisor of the National Trust, and they quite often provide a cherry picker for me to get up and look at difficult bells. or you can wait for repairs. Over the years, I've put out a number of appeals to the Guild for people to let me know when turrets are in scaffolding, and fortunately people have on occasion, and that's the one chance you often get of getting up to see bells. Well, there are perils too, of course. If there's no floor, there can be a big drop. But if the floor is dodgy, you've got the same drop underneath. So it's always important to make sure you're standing on something that looks solid and feels solid. Test it with your weight before you put your full weight on it. Old ladders can be difficult. That's a pretty flimsy looking metal ladder, probably 120, 130 years old, perched over an open drop. Not very pleasant at all. Near darkness, there are some towers where there's hardly any light in the bell chamber at all. That's difficult. Bird droppings, of course, are a real sense of danger. Poor old Paul Cattermole suffered as a result of inhaling too much pigeon dust and got psittacosis that gave him some very uncomfortable times and eventually claimed his life. So, I'm very well aware that one has to be careful in towers where bird droppings are around. But generally, belfries can be pretty filthy and horrible places, and I do sometimes wonder why I spent 50 years of my life in such nasty, horrible environments. As I say, visiting is actually about sharing experiences with friends, and friends from Whitnash on an outing there in the early 70s, somewhere down in Berkshire, Buckinghamshire, came out with me on a number of visits back in those days. There we are at Ufton in 1973 after we'd been up the tower. My old battered A35 van that was Dad's and I had after him, with Richard Jones, who's also up there in that turret with me at Hallscott Park in the middle. Christopher Dalton, as I say, was very seldom defeated, but this one on the right is actually in Herefordshire, and he was defeated that day. We never got into that belfry. Scary places? Well, they can vary. Weston-under-Wetherley is a particularly nasty one because it's a very old installation and therefore a bit fragile and dodgy. There's also a lot of bird debris up there, and there's no floor to the belfry at all. And all the worse because it's such an interesting tower that one really does want to crawl all over it and see everything. I've been up there a couple of times, but I can't say I've enjoyed it either time. The two on the left are turret jobs, but the people who hung these bells never really thought about access. And in both cases, the bells are right in the top under the pyramid spire. So to get up there, in both cases, you have to crawl your way up into this space where you've got a deep drop underneath you. And at Thurlaston, which was a school as well as a church, and the tower part is actually the teacher's house. The roof space above the teacher's bedroom just has a one beam across halfway up the spire, more or less centrally under the hatch in the top. And you have to pull yourself up on the sides of the turret, sit on the ledge with a drop behind you, and then get yourself into a standing position to get actually up into the spire to see the bell. A particularly unpleasant one. I'm glad I've done it and I don't have to go back. But of course, lots of privileged places. I mean, I'm going to tell you about some of the places that I've been to, but country houses are very much part of it. A very special visit for me was going to Baddesley Clinton before the National Trust took over. Old Captain Ferrers Walkers was still there, and he was just in the final processes of making arrangements to hand over to the Trust. And he was particularly welcoming, but actually seeing that house before the Trust got hold of it, before it was all changed, with the last private owner was a particularly sort of humbling experience, really. A very pleasant evening indeed. Shuckburgh Hall is one of the impenetrable country houses of Warwickshire. It's possible to get in occasionally, but the family's always been quite resistant to tourists of any sort, both at the hall and at the church, which is actually a private estate chapel. But I have been there, and I have crawled all over the roof to look at their bell, and also been up in the church tower a couple of times as well. Though we did get shooed off by Lady Shuckburgh once. when we asked if we could we asked if we could go into the church and have a look at the bells, and we're told very definitely, it's not convenient. And we started to say, could we come back? And the old boy, Sir Charles Shuckburgh, said, oh well, maybe, give me a ring. And his wife just said, no, Charles, we don't want them back. That was it. And at Ragley, when I went with Christopher Dalton to look at the bell in the stables, the old Lord Hertford was there, and he insisted on meeting us personally and came out and said, I just had to meet you because you're such great English eccentrics. And he showed us around and expressed it. But of course, he was a great showman anyway. When I was doing Pevsner, we had an equally memorable visit with the present Lord Hertford, who actually spent about 5.5 hours with us, showing us around the entire house and sharing his knowledge of it with us. So it's a Ragley tradition, maybe, but those are privileged visits and very memorable and enjoyable ones. A lot of the time, both in churches and secular buildings, it's a case of turn up and ask. One that was particularly rewarding was Birdingbury Hall out towards Rugby, where there's the stable block now being converted to flats called Wren Court, and it has a particularly interesting 18th century turret clock and a clock bell on the roof made in 1745 by Henry Bagley for Sir Theophilus Biddulph, who was the owner at the time. And interestingly, that ties up with what's known about the building because it was designed by an architect called Richard Trubshaw for Theophilus Biddulph at that date. So historically interesting, but also a nice one to see. I have on occasion made visits without permission, really not very often, I promise. But one of them was at Ettington Old Church before it was a hotel, and the church was just in the grounds of the country house. It was possible to visit the church, but I couldn't actually raise anyone to ask, and the door was open. I just wish I had a digital camera back then, because I did get up into the bell chamber, which I remember having been converted into a sort of geologist museum. It had got 18th century sort of fittings in, showcases and seats around the side, and it was a real treasure, but I didn't have any way of recording it, and I didn't stay long because I hadn't got permission. The bells have in fact been in 3 different churches, and they were in this one initially. They were in what's now the old church up in the modern village later, and then they were transferred to the present one. Leamington Brewery was a council depot when I went to visit in the early 70s, and you can see it's got a bell high up under the eaves. About 6 months before it was eventually pulled down, I did manage to get in, but there was just nobody to ask, but the building was open. So I ventured up and managed to check out the bell before it got removed. We also had difficulty getting in at Compton Verney because, as you know, that estate went through a load of troubled times before it was eventually taken over and reopened as it is now. It was just impossible to know who to ask, but there was rumoured to be a guy who looked after the place who you might find on site. And after about a number of visits, we did eventually manage to get in and got up into the terrace and found that the bell was recast in 1823. The turret, though, isn't there on that plan of the buildings in 1738. The owner at this time was in fact a bit of a bad lad, an asset stripper who didn't really do the building a lot of cop, and he sold the clock among other things and did a very unsuitable development in the back of the stable yard. But he was adamant that the whole thing was by Wyatt. I'd actually seen Wyatt's drawings and knew that the turret wasn't. Unfortunately, we didn't quite clinch it, but I did find from the accounts that the clock was made in 1762. So we eventually got in through the front door and managed to do it, but it was a case where persistence really did pay off. Another case where persistence paid off was Morton Bagot. 2 lovely old bells there, one of them those plaster casts of the inscription, and with very ancient fittings, probably 16th, 17th century fittings. In that little turret, and I used to be able to hear those from our garden at home, as I said earlier. The vicar just would not let me go up that turret. He said it's unsafe. He said he'd known someone die from falling from a horse, and he wasn't going to let me climb the 15 feet up to the turret. A change of vicar, and I eventually got in. The vicar who said no eventually became Archdeacon of Warwick, and I could imagine he was a pretty good henchman for the bishop. It's not just the old parish churches, though. The survey that I've done has included every single church in the county, including all the modern churches built since 1900 or built since Tilly and Walters wrote. Willen Hall in Coventry and Tile Hill and the Spence churches, of course, are among them. Also, the churches of other denominations, Roman Catholic, Avon Dasset has an 1855 clock and a contemporary Mears bell. And Nosberg's at Coventry has a quite big 1308 Murphy bell, and which at the time I thought it was really quite a rare find. I now know that Murphy's almost flooded the Roman Catholic market in England with bells, but at the time very few of them have been reported on and published. So when I found this Murphy bell up there, I thought I'd really found something quite special. When I got down, the priest insisted that I went to the Catholic club with him for a pint. That's the sort of welcome you tend to get in the Catholic churches. Not many of the other denominations have bells, of course, but Radford Semley Baptist Church has a bell and a clock, and there's a chime of 8 at Umberslade, just near Hockley Heath, by Gillett, 1878. The Roman Catholic churches, of course, have been good for rich pickings, as well as the lovely and notable ring at Leamington Roman Catholic Church that were unringable and not rung at all back then. There are chimes of 8 at Rugby, that lovely spire on the left, and Princethorpe, which was, when I went first, was still a monastic institution with brown cloaked clerics around. Rugby, of course, has the 2 towers, and there's a single bell in the other tower as well. Now, Warwick was looking like a difficult one. That turret is way high off the village street, off the street. Wondered how on earth I'd ever managed to find details. And was driving past with Christopher Dalton one day, and we saw it in scaffolding. So we knocked on the door of the presbytery. To be sure you can go up, he says, and I'll come up with you. So there he is, the priest, right up on that high scaffolding with us, looking at what turned out to be another Murphy bell. There are other forms of religious buildings. Cemetery chapels generally are quite good sources for finding bells. A steel one at Shipston, and a little Taylor bell at Hill Morton. And other buildings like old schools, the parish offices in Nuneaton, which is the old grammar school, which has a bell cast in Leicester by Edward Arnold in the 1780s. All of those I've looked at. Plenty of other sorts of clock towers. Hatton Hospital, I went up the tower and didn't get detained back in the days when it was still a lunatic asylum or an asylum. There are clock towers like Leamington, that has a Taylor clock chime of 5 bells. And of the civic buildings, Leamington's town hall is definitely the most prestigious. A long climb up to the 1400 weight Taylor bell at the top of that tower. The sort of place where it's now very, very difficult to get in. I've tried to have another look in the last few years. I've just got a flat no. There are other clock towers. Rugby, I haven't seen myself, but Jeff Armitage, who worked on the clock, got me what details it was possible to get. The American Fountain at Stratford is quite an interesting one, an 1880s clock tower and water fountain in the marketplace. If you go to Stratford Mop, you'll find yourself whizzing past that turret in a ride of some sort. But it's got one small bell in it now, but it used to have a little clock chime of 5 that I've now managed to find out about. A fabulous little building there. And in terms of country houses, the finest is undoubtedly at Hampton Manor, Hampton in Arden. That Eden Nesfield clock tower built in the 1890s, a really wonderful thing, a super building. The bell was still there when I went, but the clock had already been stolen. I don't know if the bell's still there now. Industrial buildings, transport buildings, factories like Courtaulds in Coventry, a Gillett and Johnston bell and a clock of the same date. Canal workshops at Hartshill and Hill Morton, both with bells and interesting clocks. And railway stations like Nuneaton. In fact, I don't think there is a bell there, but it's quite common for stations to have clocks and bells. None that I've found or that I can remember in Warwickshire. And some most unusual belfries. I remember being absolutely delighted when, having looked at the main bell in Warwick School, in the red brick building at the front. I was told they got another one on the cricket pavilion. And not only have they got a bell, but it's a 1693 bell by Richard Keane of Woodstock that was originally in the market hall. So that was a great find. And a private house at Hatton Rock near Hampton Lucy has a fabulous 1500 weight Taylor bell. It makes them a very good tenor from a demolished church in Harrogate, St Luke's. The chap who owned the house and had this turret put up was a friend of the demolition contractor. And when St Luke's came down, the contractor had the bell, and it ended up in Warwickshire. It's got ringing fittings, but no wheel, though you wouldn't ring it where it is. And there are, of course, some no bell towers. Camden in Coventry is one. I've actually been up in the timbers of the spire just to make sure, but there's no bell there. Similarly, at Chalesmore, there was the 8 that never was. When that church was built in the 50s, they put in a brand new 8-bell frame from Whitechapel and borrowed a bell from Taylor's just for the consecration, but that didn't stay long. They never put any bells in it, and the frame has now been reused at Beeley and at Radford Semele. But in the basement of the church, when I first went, was the bell from Christ Church, Coventry, the third spire in Coventry, which crashed down when the church was bombed, and was taken to the new church, but it's in pieces and on display in the church now as a war relic. Gone in my lifetime, or emptied in my lifetime. I wasn't around quite early enough doing this to have actually seen the bells at Elmscote, the 3-tier Taylor 8 that was taken out in the early 1960s. Doris Randall got some details for me from Anthony Randall, no relation, but someone she knew. And I've since found full details of the old bells from Taylor's records. The other great 1960s loss, though, was the freestanding campanile at Holy Trinity, Coventry. I remember going to Coventry in the late 1960s, looking forward to seeing it, but it went a few years before I got there. The other 3 buildings still survive, but the towers are all now empty. Little Packington had 3 bells that were only ever really slung up in that turret. When the church was made redundant, they were sold off. 2 of them are now at Halford, and I've forgotten where the other one was, but it's still around. The Guild and Harry Windsor managed to find new homes for those. Winderton, in the middle at the bottom, was actually a rather fun tower. They were a ringable 3, bells 1, 3, 5 of 5, sorry, 2, 4, 6 of 6. And I can remember ringing there one Sunday afternoon, coming out and then hearing Braille's bells coming up the valley from below. It was a wonderful moment, having come out of an interesting tower to ring at and hearing Braille's bells in the distance being rung. The other one is Atherstone on Stour, 3 interesting bells that have now gone to homes elsewhere. So I picked up quite a few of those, but not all of them before it's too late. One of the things that certainly kept me interested in the early days was the hope of finding unknown ringable bells, with very little success, I might add, apart from Winderton, maybe. 3 bell towers were obvious. I've said how Paul got me interested in these lesser places, and so exploring the 3 bell towers was part of the fun. Willie's one that seemed possible, but actually they were very well beaten up even by the early 70s. Also, the possibility that some of the chimes might actually be rings. A vain hope, of course. And chimes were then listed in doves, so it was easy to find out where they were. St Thomas Longford, middle bottom, has a very lovely little Taylor chime of 400 weight 8. At the top, Kenilworth St John, a chime of 10, Taylor's 1950s, actually an 8 with 2 semitones. And Coventry St John's is a lost ring. They were a ring, and there's some records of ringing on them, but they were hung dead when the clock was put in the 1880s. But they were all interesting places to explore, with just that faint hope I might have found something ringable. I have made a number of discoveries, not surprisingly. The greatest one, without doubt, was the market bell at Stratford-on-Avon. Knowing Stratford well, I was fairly sure there must have been a bell in the old market hall on the left there. Made inquiries in the bank, as it was, Barclays Bank then, They said, oh no, in any case, it's not our building. You'll have to ask the town council. Well, I approached the town council and they told me that there had been a bell and it was in a store at the back of Rook's, wine merchants, and the yard in the middle photograph there, colour photograph at the bottom, was where I found the bell. Walked in only to be confronted by this early 14th century bell by a rare London founder. Whoopee, a great find. The bell had been in the old market hall, Market Cross, which is in the middle at the top. And since it's been discovered, the council's never really known quite what to do with it. It's been in 3 different locations in the Bell Court shopping centre. 2 of them are shown there. And after spending a good 10 years in the pit at Taylor's in storage, it was rehung in 2017 in yet another position at the entrance to Bell Court. But it's a fine bell and quite a significant one. It's just a shame that nobody can really see it and there's no means of sounding it. Of the country house discoveries, probably the best was Stoneleigh Abbey. The gatehouse, as you can see on the left, has a clock, and the old engraving at the bottom shows the clock turret that used to be on the roof. The clock turret is gone, but the bells have simply been slung up in the roof, really difficult to get out and to look at. But 3 quite important early bells, 2 by a rare founder, Henry Oldfield, 1620, and another late 16th century one by Newcomb of Leicester. The hour bell is a Mears bell of 1851. That bell wheel and headstock on the back of the main building had the alarm bell of 1845. And when I went to look round initially, there was a Ruddle bell of 1706, recast in the 50s, sitting in a cabbage patch in the kitchen garden. Why they put it there, I don't know. I don't think there was rhubarb under it. Sorry, I don't think it was used for growing rhubarb, but it was just sitting in the garden. Another discovery of immigrants and emigrants. St John's, Leamington, a very fine Victorian church on the south side of Leamington, tall spire there. Church built 1877 to 1888, with the tower and spire being the last bit built. And when we went up there with some of the Whitnash lads, we found 2 old bells, 1676 and 1745. And it didn't take much digging to discover that they'd come from North Piddle Church in Worcestershire, great place name, which was rebuilt without a turret about the same date, so the bells were transferred. I'm pretty sure the framework they're in was actually on the ground at St John's originally, and then when they built the tower, they just lifted it all up complete. They look ringable, but there's no clappers in them, so that wasn't a grab. The other interesting one was the other way around, an exported bell that emigrated to Surrey. Looking through George Elphick's notes on Surrey bells, I saw an inscription that looked familiar on a bell that George Elphick couldn't identify the founder. And I thought I'd seen that inscription somewhere before, and also thought that it looked like a bell by Joseph Smith of Edgbaston. And it turned out to be the old treble from Kenilworth. It was recast in the 1870s, supposedly. But in fact, Taylor's didn't recast it. They sold the bell on to a church in Surrey instead. So Kenilworth's old treble survives down in a church in Surrey. And Taylor's refurbished it about 3 or 4 years ago. Abbot Salford is another interesting case of a theft and a rediscovery. Quite an interesting discovery when it was made. The bell's actually mentioned in the Victoria County history, so it wasn't really a discovery that I can claim. But you can see that this 1610 bell by Henry Farmer of Gloucester or Evesham is a beauty and not in very good condition when I first saw it. It's in that turret right on the roof that you can see in the middle photo. And there's Christopher's photo of me looking at it back in the early 80s, 81. Now, when the hotel closed and the tatters took over for a while and stripped everything out they could, the bell disappeared. The police recovered it, but they didn't quite manage to work out where it came from. And they sold off at auction all the stuff that had been recovered. And somebody did realise where it had come from and got it back. So it's now in the foyer of the present hotel. And there's a dummy bell up in the turret. Another great discovery was the Courtaulds clock bell from Nuneaton. The factory is gone and the bell is no longer in Warwickshire, but this isn't a little find at all. It's a 30 hundredweight bell, Gillett and Johnson 1920. Now at the British Horological Institute headquarters at Upton Hall near Newark. But I can remember hearing it going off with the clock striking when I was looking around Nuneaton in my student days and wondering where on earth it was. And eventually worked out that it must have been in that factory. And it's good to have been to have found it. So discoveries come in all shapes and sizes. But as well as just recording what's where, I got really interested in the history and wanted to write the complete history of each tower. Which of course is a huge job when you start thinking about the amount of documentation there is. I used to started visiting the county record office in the yard behind Shire Hall in the late 60s, and it was really that started me off on what became my career. The record office now is in Priory Park in the modern building below. Now, although Warwick and part of the church was destroyed in the Great Fire of Warwick in 1694, the history of St Mary's Warwick bells is extremely well documented in the surviving records, including full documentation of the putting in of the Ruddle 10 in an anti-clockwise frame in 1702. So writing up tower histories was sort of took over really for me from simply going out and finding facts. Those sort of things were too detailed by far for what I'd got in mind for the county book. And when the restoration of the cathedral bells was underway in 1986 and 7, I did do a separate book on the bells of Coventry Cathedral, only telling the story up to when they were rehung in the 20s, because the story of the rehang and bringing them back to a ringing peal can be told by somebody else later on. I'd like to show you though that lovely watercolour of the two churches at Coventry in the 18th century. And also the tower that we so nearly got. If George Woodcock, who'd promised to pay for it, hadn't died suddenly without leaving a will, we would have had this Paley and Austin tower of the 1890s, purpose-built tower for the old bells of that date. It would have been a fine piece of architecture. Other interesting discoveries: Walsgrave, the 5. I used to hitch a lift from opposite the church when I was on my way back to Leicester very often. And I saw the bells before they were rehung and recast, and the frame turned out to be rather interesting because it tells part of the story of the bells. From the frame, it's possible to work out they're anti-clockwise 4, then turned into a slightly strange rope circle 5. And accounts of ringing there in the 1920s. There was a peal on them in 1927, so it was quite a hellhole to ring in. The frame was preserved for a while, but kids used it as a smoking den and the police eventually asked for it to be removed. But the really interesting survival that turned up in the debris when they cleared the tower was this ringer's post, dated 1778. It's got a peg on the bottom so it would sit in a socket in the centre of the ringing room between the four anti-clockwise ropes. And it's got the changes on it for ringing call changes by call to change. It's the method we know today as double Canterbury minimus, rung on an anti-clockwise 4. And so you would ring and follow the bell. The changes are numbered, and you'd ring the bell each time the conductor called change. You'd follow the next bell going down the list. A remarkable survival, and of course a lot of ringing must have been like that. Hatton is an interesting tower and has a ring of 6 by Barwell that are hardly the best peal of bells in the county. It's a nice looking tower. Interesting history because Dugdale tells us there were once 3 foreign bells in the ring of 5 there. But if you look on the wall, you'll see a notice that gives details of 8 bells. You think someone must have got that wrong. Not at all. It's one of the very rare cases of a peal of bells that has been reduced in number rather than augmented. They became 8 during the incumbency of Dr. Samuel Parr, who had been a ringer at Harrow in his youth and always had a very keen interest in bells. He'd been headmaster of Norwich School, where Paul Cattermole later taught, and wrote the history. So Paul was very knowledgeable about Parr. And he, after leaving Norwich, he became vicar of Hatton and ran a private school there from 1780 until 1825. Bit of an eccentric, but said to be the most learned man in England. But he loved bells. He had the old 800 weight 5 replaced by a 1300 weight 6 in 1809. And when the new bells arrived, he had the tenor upturned in the churchyard and filled with beer, so that they could all celebrate. And in 1817, he had two trebles added to make 8. And we have a record of 1 peal rung on them. That's actually taken from my Coventry book, because the peal was rung by the Coventry ringers. So I've been working on this book of Warwickshire bells for 50 years. It's probably too big for a book, and books may no longer be the appropriate way of doing it anyway. But unfortunately, it's never been finished. My belfry interests are not confined to Warwickshire. I've spent a lot of time recording bell frames up and down the country. Generally speaking, trying to help people to get rid of frames that aren't suitable for continued use, because the climate these days is very much for repair and retention rather than replacement. And I've tried to help people to get rid of them, but at the same time make sure that a sensible historical record is preserved. Exploring places with Christopher Dalton and John Eisel on the left there, derelict church up in North Staffordshire. So bell frames has ended up taking up quite a lot of my time. I have other historical interests in churches generally. I did in Bedfordshire, not as part of my job, but very much associated with my job, write a series of 4 books on Bedfordshire churches. And thanks to someone I met later on in my time in Bedfordshire, I got very interested in turret clocks. I'd always been interested in clocks from early days, but was a bit afraid of them technically as to how to describe them and what to say about them. But I managed to pick all that up from a friend, Ken Shrimpton, and we worked on a project on Bedfordshire clocks together. And I produced a book on Bedfordshire clock and watchmakers, a biographical dictionary. Again, not at work, but associated with work. And more recently, I spent 6 years revising the Buildings of England volume for Warwickshire in the Pevsner series. A huge undertaking, really, going around every single building in the county. But particularly interesting, I felt, because I'd known the county so well 30 years earlier. It was absolutely fascinating coming back and seeing how things had changed and how things hadn't changed. Some of the villages and revisiting places that I love. South Warwickshire, I find absolutely delightful. There's a wonderful unspoilt belt of countryside around Philongley and Maxstoke that I got to know better. And of course, the Edgehill villages all up are delightful too. So it was great to explore, and actually doing Coventry in detail and exploring Rugby, Nuneaton, parts of the west side of Nuneaton have got some very interesting Victorian buildings. Great, but it's diverted me from bells. The strange thing is the time is so wrong now for doing anything on bells as a subject, and yet it's also so right. Tilly and Walters, shown there, who did the original book, their interest in bells and anything antiquarian really belong to a past age. It's completely off the radar now as anything, and the word antiquarian, which bell study I'm afraid is regarded as, is very unfashionable in academic terms. So in some ways it's completely not the time to be doing this thing. And I know that, and I've known it for a long time. But one of the paradoxes of history is that the further we are from the past, actually, the greater our knowledge and understanding of it, because so many new research techniques have come on board. Archive and historical research materials are more accessible than they were, and we're better able to simulate this information using modern technologies, digital cameras and computers and all that sort of thing. Who could have thought, when I started going through every volume of the Bell News back in the early 70s and making copious notes, that they'd be available on CD for scanning, for word searching. the newspapers and the British Newspaper Archive at Collingdale in London. I used to go down there on a Saturday morning and go through several years worth of the Warwick Advertiser, or the the Leamington Journal, whatever. That all that stuff would be electronically searchable on your computer at home. And even the 16th, 17th, 18th century parish records for Warwickshire are now on screen as images via the Ancestry website. So it's now possible to answer the questions, do a thorough job on research that just couldn't have been done back in the early days of this project, let alone before that. So the project I started back in 1968 when I visited Great Orme is still a project pending. I've got most of the information or access to it. I just need some time, and tea always helps. The mug is always a very important part of the desktop furnishings. So that's a personal canter through Warwickshire bells, my involvement with them, some of the things I've seen, some of the things that are interesting, some of the people who've come with me and shared with me. So I'd just like to thank you for the opportunity to reminisce a bit, and I hope that you found it interesting. Thank you.
Chris, thank you. That was fantastic. What a lot of information you've passed to us. So I don't know whether people have got questions, but if you'd like to put your hands up, you'll raise your hand if you've got a question that maybe you'd like to put to Chris. Mike, if you could help me just spot if any hands go up. A question I'd like to ask you, Chris, while we work this out. I did hear that the metal that's in Harbour Magna Church is also in Big Ben. Is that right?
No, it
Oh.
can't be.
Well, that's a good answer.
One of the bells at Harbour Magna is a Taylor bell of the early 1850s, which is the right sort of date for Big Ben, but it's the Big Ben and the quarter bells were cast by Warner's originally, and Whitechapel recast the Big Bell. So you've got different foundries, right date.
Okay.
But what might be true is that the Harbour Magna bell was in the foundry around the same time as the bells to the Royal Exchange in London.
Well, I heard it was actually Great Paul. The old bell from Harbour Magna, the metal was used towards the metal for Great Paul. I don't know if that ties up.
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
No. It's rumours what go round over the years.
Yeah. I know exactly what. I mean, I can't tell you off the top of my head, but it's known exactly what metal went into Great Paul. In the foundry records, there's a list of all the metal they put in the furnace, and it's got. An old bell from Reading, for example, St Lawrence Reading Old Tenor was one of the bells that went in. But I know and could find out. I'm sure that if I were to look at it, I'd find there's absolutely no connection.
I was looking forward to dining out on that for another 3 months, Chris. You've really shattered me now. What can I say?
The parishes have rumours, what's going on and things like that. So,
have we got any hands raised? Oh yes, we do. I did see one. Richard, I think that's Richard East. Have you got your hand up? Would you like? You'll have to unmute yourself for us, Richard.
No, I haven't. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No, that's fine. You can just testing. You can lower your hand now if you like. Has anybody else got their hand? Oh yes, there's
Joy.
Joy, you've got a question.
Can't unmute. Yes, I'm unmuted. Although Chris says now we could go onto the internet and we can go and research all this lot sort of from the seats in our study, if he's quite honest about it, if you were given the choice to do it the way you've done it and had the fun you've had, or sitting at a computer and doing it that way, I'm sure we'd probably know which way you'd go.
Yes, I do see what you mean, but actually I also like the accessibility of things. I think when you get to the sort of writing up stage, being able to go in and search these things and go very specifically, you're looking for a particular word, you're looking for a particular name, and going straight there, and being able to check on things like, the Bell News reports, that sort of access to it is fine. But yes, the real pleasure of it has been at getting out and seeing this stuff, notwithstanding the horrors of the pigeon shit and ladders with broken rungs. So yes, you're right.
Chris, Mike Chester here. as a bell ringer and a bell historian, do you get conflict between, would you really like to ring on a really grotty old file that's barely ringable in a nice church against to a brand new ring of bells? Do you get two different opinions depending on which hat you're wearing?
Well, no, I mean, I'm a great big ape, and there's nothing I like better than hauling around some great lump of metal. You know that. And therefore, I do enjoy the tough places. I thoroughly enjoyed a peel at Chadshunt, for example, a couple of years ago. I hope that not all of those places disappear, but I also just love the sound of good bells. Good bells don't all have to be new. I think there's some lovely bells around. Monk's Kirby are a very enjoyable, rewarding ring. They're not perfect by any means tonally, but they're great. So I enjoy the historic bells as well as the new ones. But actually, the thing I like best is a decent, heavy, true harmonic ring like Worcester or well, Worcester. Because there I can be an ape as well as enjoy the sound.
Any other questions? Oh, Mr. Mew, I think you've got your hand up.
Oh, we're doing electron. Can't find the electron account.
Not a question. Just first of all, thank you, Chris, for a fascinating talk. Just to tell out the people that are watching, to remind them that the Guild Library has got a copy of Mr. Pickford's book about Coventry bells, together with the one that was written by Harry Windsor and Ray Winter about the new bells. So they are available in our library, as is a copy of the, albeit out of date, Tilly and Walter's history of Warwickshire bells, which is still very interesting reading in terms of a lot of the background facts. Just on a personal point, Chris, your good friend Paul Cattermole, I first rang a peal with him in 1961. A long time ago.
When he was in London, I expect. Yeah.
Of course, his widow Barbara is still ringing down at New Buckingham.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you, Chris.
Okay. As far as Tilly and Walters is concerned, I'd steer anyone who does want to look at it to the Whiting Society website. The Whiting Society is a ringing society, but Michael Folds has been putting all the old ringing books online in a place where you can find them all in the same place, and you've got easy access to them. So if you want to look at Tilly and Walters, that's the place to go if you want it from home. It's on the Internet Archive, it's on Google Books, but the Whiting Society is the easy place to find them.
Any final questions then before we let Chris go? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Yes, Anna, it's Andrew, in spite of what it might say. Yeah. Very good evening to Chris and to everyone else. We know from our work on trying to update installations that there's a considerable element of preserving historically important things. Do you think we ought to be able to find a place, perhaps the size of Stoneleigh Park, to put all these historical things rather than cluttering up towers and making your job so very much more difficult to go and look at them in the future?
It's very difficult. The question of preserving bell frames is there isn't an easy answer. I mean, there is in Nottinghamshire a redundant church that's got half a dozen frames in, but they're actually meaningless if they're not in a tower with bells in. And the old job at Redford Seminary before the fire, the frame was slung up on cables above the new installation. You couldn't actually get up and see it. It is so difficult. But if you can't preserve in use, to my mind, there's not a lot of point in keeping it, because once you move a frame out of the way, it loses its context and significance. That's not, unfortunately, how the heritage people see it. And at the moment, heritage wins all. I'm perhaps a bit of an odd fish in the sense that although I'm a historian and therefore ought to be passionately interested in these artifacts, I'm not. I see history as a continuum, and what comes next is just as important as what's gone by. But that's not a commonly held view among historians, and the preservationist lobby does have the whip hand at the moment. But I don't think finding a barn and filling it with everything you can is really the answer, because it's hard to preserve any meaning in it.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I think some of the things the Victorian Society preserves at all costs. wants to, and we find what if you actually take it out, they actually destroyed things which are far more interesting and much more worthy of preservation than their own efforts.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Chris.
But I've just had a quick whiz through. I don't think we've got any more questions. Is that right? Well, on behalf of the Guild and all of us here tonight, and I think there's over 50 of us, Chris, I'd like to thank you very much for a great talk. It's been really informative. I've learned so much. We are going to be sharing this on the Guild website and I think on YouTube too, so other people can see it. And as a token of our appreciation, there's a small gift coming through the post to you tomorrow.
Oh, thank you.
So I'll send you all the details, but thank you very much.
Got to come between the grocery man, the fish man. And
yeah, that's right. Yes, yes,
they're all
that's
having
right.
all this stuff delivered these days. So
yeah. So it should be arriving tomorrow.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. Thanks for everybody for being here. Yes, claps. I think everybody's putting claps up to say thank you, Chris. That was great.
Thank you.
Can I just as Guild President say also thank you to Chris in that capacity, and obviously we will all take away the message to our towers that anything odd and interesting that comes up may just be something that you've not come across. And as you say, I suspect your job feels a bit like painting the Forth Road Bridge in the old days, when there was always something. Just when you thought you'd finished, something new came up and just occasionally consumed a lot of your time, sometimes for great reward and sometimes was really, really little consequence. Thank you very much indeed for your time today and the undoubtedly large amount of time you spent preparing for this evening.
Well, I'd just like to say I thank Chris because he makes my job so much easier. All I do is email Chris if I want to know details of bells or anything, and I get the reply, you know, half an hour later, an hour later. And so not many Darlington Bells advisors can just turn to something. Yes, we know about every bell everywhere. So I'm just really pleased that I haven't got to do it myself. So, and I'd say it's nearly 50 years since Chris called my first peal at Wootton Warwick. So well,
neither of you look that old, so I don't know. He must have been, you know, it must have been. But he's also helped me because you probably know that it's the 200th anniversary this year of the Elicum. And I wondered how many Elicums, I used to say Elicums, but now I'm on the, you know, and now they say Elicum, that how many Elicums there are in Warwickshire, and there are more than we thought. So because this bicentenary celebration's coming up and there's going to be a big publicity launch on the 25th of March, I'm going to be writing to everybody who's got one just to make sure that they've got some information about what's coming up. And just a final word, we've got another talk in 2 weeks' time on the 16th of March, when Joy's going to be picking up on some of the things Chris said about the rehanging of Coventry Cathedral and the fundraising that went on to make that possible. So I hope as many of you will join us for that as have tonight. And Chris, just a final thank you to you. It's been fantastic. So thank you very much. And thanks everybody, and see you soon.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.